British Foreign Minister William Hague has warned that Russia could face significant costs if it refuses to withdraw its troops from the autonomous region of Crimea in southern Ukraine, a country represented by this embassy in West Belfast. He has also raised the spectre of economic sanctions, echoing the words of US President Barack Obama. Addressing the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov claimed the deployment of Russian troops to Ukraine is aimed at freeing the country from a spiral of violence. Meanwhile, reports have continued to suggest hundreds of Russian troops were being directed towards Crimea as the political crisis continues in the former Soviet state. The UK and the US have been at the forefront of public criticism of Russia. Yet these self-same countries have a track record of interfering in the affairs of other states, such as Iraq and Afghanistan. So how much do the public know about Crimea? Are they concerned about double standards by the West? And do they fear that Western actions could themselves spark a war? These are the simple questions we sought to answer, and we began by gauging public awareness of events in Ukraine. Have you heard what's going on in the Ukraine?
Yeah, I have indeed heard many of what's happening between the oppositions, between extreme left, extreme right, and taking power of legitimate leaders and not legitimate leaders, and democracy isn't being taken into account. And yeah, I think the political situation is a bit similar before World War II, in which after prolonged depression of economic depression, there's a rise of extreme powers that always clash, and that's what's happening in the moment.
Yes, I've been following it on the news.
What have you seen?
I've seen the reporting. I've seen the protest that happened in Independence Square. I've seen Putin's reaction. I've seen the West reaction, the US, the UK, William Hague. So I've basically been informed by what mainstream media has written on it or reported.
Have you heard what's going on in Ukraine?
Yeah, I have heard about it, and actually we've been reading about it a lot, in particular because I've got family from Armenia, which is not far, so it's quite interesting for us, and just an interesting topic in general, particularly with the East-West relations at the moment.
Yes, I have heard what's going on in Ukraine. From what my friends who study politics say, that it's an invasion of democracy, an invasion from Russia, from Putin going into Ukraine. That's pretty much what I know.
So what is going on in the Ukraine? Do we have a picture of unfolding developments? Here's what our experts said.
What's taking place in the Ukraine has essentially been a so-called revolution. The president's been ousted, and obviously Russia sees this as a massive threat. If you look at the map, NATO countries pretty much surround Russia. So, many of us that were monitoring the situation knew that Russia would react, and Russia has reacted by sending in its troops and pro-Russian militia into Crimea to kind of annex the region.
Well, Ukraine, simply it's Crimea has joined Russia now, and Ukraine has been redefined, but that's the surface of it. But fundamentally, there is a profound change going on, and it's only the beginning of what's going to happen. But it's a very significant development that took place in Ukraine. The government changed, and a pro-West government was installed, and then the Crimea had a referendum, and it joined by 97% vote. It joined Russia. These are very significant developments.
Next, we asked the public if they felt the media was giving them enough information about what's going on in the Ukraine, whether that information seemed biased towards the European Union, and how the media could report it better. Here's what they said. Has the British media given you enough information about it? Is it too pro-European Union biased? And could they report it better?
I think they could report it better. I think it certainly has been promoted in a particular way that was very Euro-centric approach, I would say.
I think that the British media does give out a lot of information, but like any other media channel, it's very biased.
it has had a pro-European bias, which is what you'd expect, and it's also partly valid because the Ukraine, these whole problems started because they wanted to come closer to the EU. Changing my media report of it, I guess there doesn't seem to have been much like on the ground, in depth working, like talking and reporting from the place itself. It seems to have been much more distant and reporting what these groups have said on their Facebooks, on their blog posts, rather than like reporters on the ground. So I think that might be more helpful.
Has the British media given you enough information about it, or is it too pro-European Union biased? And essentially, could they report it better?
I mean, there seems to be a bit of a contradiction in what they're saying. I mean, on the one hand, they're saying that this is such a horrible act that Russia are going into Crimea and whatnot, but then the actual statistics are saying there's 97% of people in favour of being part of Russia. So the BBC seem to be giving me kind of two different views on the subject, and quite contradictory, I think.
It's very shame because England is the country that is destroying most of the world. It's not England who divides Sudan. It's not England who divides Kosovo. How many countries did Russia invade in the last 20 years compared to UK and America? So I think our politicians, they should consider, people are rising up. People are trying to understand what's going on because they're leading us in the wrong way.
So the public do have criticisms about how the media have been reporting what's been going on in the Ukraine. They do feel that a better job could be made with less biased reporting. We asked our experts if they agreed with that analysis. Here's what they said.
The British media is actually quite interesting in how they've approached this. They've obviously had an institutional bias and a national bias towards the UK. For example, I think that they've failed in the duty to tell the public about the NATO bases that surround Russia, to explain the history of NATO and explain why really Russia would want to have such a vested interest in Ukraine. And it's almost seemed like the Ukraine is a buffer zone between, or the last front between Russia and NATO. And it's not about East versus West, it's more about a conflict over interest, a conflict over resources, and what America and the UK see as a threat towards them, which is Russia. Hence, they want Ukraine to be pro-West, pro-European Union, so they can establish a NATO base there and NATO troops. Now, if we look at what's happening in Crimea, there are more people in Crimea that were celebrating the referendum on Russia as opposed to people celebrating the welcoming of the occupation in Iraq on the streets of Baghdad. And if you look at the contrast in terms of how they were reported, so for example, Iraq, Baghdad was reported as the people coming out in the streets, cheering in the Americans and clapping, and there was hardly a critical voice from journalists. But actually, if you look comparatively in Crimea, the percentages are much higher in terms of those that want to be with Russia, yet that isn't reported in the same manner.
To be fair, it has been biased. It has made it out a sort of land grab, Russian expansion, same sort of mindset that was behind when they set up NATO. It was projecting Russia as the evil in Europe and scaremongering, scaring all the European states that you are now in danger from Russia and setting up NATO to save them from Russia. It's the same mindset as if Russia was going in its Tsarist and in its Soviet times and trying to expand and go to Crimea, go to other parts of Ukraine which are inhabited by Russian-speaking people. So this is what sort of impression the British media gave. It definitely did not give a balanced view of the reality.
British Foreign Secretary William Hague has threatened Russia with significant costs if it does not withdraw its troops from Ukraine. We wondered if the public felt this was okay, or whether they felt that this was an inappropriate threat towards a country such as Russia. British Foreign Secretary William Hague has warned Russia of what he's called significant costs if it doesn't withdraw troops from Ukraine. How do you feel about Britain warning a country like Russia in that way?
Well, I think as we've seen in the past, there's been so many times, there was the situation with Iran and the USA where there's been warnings and warnings. I think, if you're going to make a warning, you've got to have to do something about it. And I think personally, for England, the best thing to do would be to just stay clear of these kind of things. Obviously, it's good to, obviously you want to put a strong stand, like in the sense of sanctions and so on, because there's people, and people are people everywhere. But I think that it would be best right now for England to focus on England rather than other places in the world.
Well, to be honest, I'm not from the UK, but I think economic sanctions is very effective, and I think if you can put economic sanctions to help human rights and to help democracies, then I think that's very effective. But like I said, I can't comment on it because I don't really know what the sanction he's proposing, etc. And I think that was pretty ambiguous what he said as well.
I guess it's in the interests of Britain to maintain, whatever economic relationships it has with the Ukraine and with Russia. So it's like realpolitik, isn't it? He's gonna say what he thinks is best for his country, which might not be the best for Ukraine or for Russia.
British Foreign Secretary William Hague has warned Russia of significant costs if it doesn't withdraw troops from the Ukraine. How do you feel about Britain warning a country the size of Russia in that way?
I don't really support the way that I don't support a bellicose response to the situation. I haven't supported the initial approach there was going to be to Syria, which fortunately we rolled back from. So I would feel that that it's not the right way.
I think it smacks of hypocrisy in many ways, considering how we've been active in Afghanistan and Iraq. So yes, I find it quite difficult as a British citizen to sort of take that point of view.
So concerns raised there about Britain's threats towards Russia and the situation in the Ukraine. We turn to our experts to understand the extent to which those kinds of threats have been appropriate.
I think that Russia won't take what William Hague has to say very seriously. I think that the West lost all moral high ground a very long time ago. Even if you look recently, John Kerry said you can't just invade countries on false pretenses in the 21st century, but you only need to look back to the Iraq War to see that actually that's what the West did. Even further back, if you look at the kind of colonial empire and how they invaded countries and how they occupied people. And I don't think that the West has any moral high ground. So I think that really what William Hague should be doing is engaging in diplomacy. And at least I think it's time that people, journalists and politicians, start looking at the world from a different angle. Put yourselves in the shoes of the Russians for a second and see how they see it and how they see Ukraine or the change of regime in Ukraine as a threat towards them. And then maybe they can sit down and talk and come to a diplomatic solution to all this.
I really do not like. I mean, they have made a joke of themselves and they stand exposed. They should have been cautious because Russia is not a sort of banana republic, or for that matter, it's not a medium-sized power also. It's a full-fledged. It has inherited all that was in Soviet Union. It has missiles and geography, economy, everything that goes into a building of a proper sort of superpower. So they should have not said this thing for Russia. But now they have said they stand exposed because most of the analysts agree that there's hardly anything they can do. They might bring sanctions and all this, but ultimately that's a double-edged weapon. It won't hurt Russia only, it will hurt them as well.
The UK's warnings have been widely criticised, given Britain's own infringements in countries such as Afghanistan and Iraq. Is the UK guilty of double standards? Here's the public's view. The UK's warnings have been widely criticised, given that Britain infringed in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq. Is the UK guilty of double standards?
I wouldn't blame the UK, I would just blame diplomatic supremacy by the US due to their money. So a lot of countries out of diplomatics follow what the US says, but I think it's unjust that Crimea is taking upon something that breaks human rights, but going into a country just for oil. Well, what my knowledge tells me that. I think that doesn't justify, you cannot criticize something you do at the same time.
I think our claims for the Falklands are not dissimilar, but probably not as modern as Russia's claims for the Crimea.
when their own foreign policy is just loaded with contradictions, and they've essentially messed up the world for the rest of the people in it. So, I mean, there's double standards everywhere, really.
More than double standards, I can call it quarter standards, because what they're doing, not long ago they went to overthrow Libya. They went to regime change in Libya. Not even 2 years ago. Is it Russia went to, how many countries did Russia overthrow so far compared to the UK? So I think the media, they should consider giving the people the real information, because the people now, there's internet, there's different sort of media. We know the real information, what's going on. I think media should be very careful in giving us not one-sided information.
So many people do feel that the UK is guilty of double standards. We turn to our experts to look at the facts and whether those backed up that belief.
I think, whenever we listen to politicians, I think, there's always a sense of double standards, especially when they accuse Russia of infringing on Ukraine's sovereignty. I think if you just look at the drone strikes taking place in Pakistan, in Yemen, and even Somalia, we talk about the supporting regimes around the world with dictatorships, or staying quiet on the issue of Bahrain when Saudi troops come rolling in to quash a revolution. I think that there's always double standards from the people around the world who are complaining about Russia but have stayed quiet on so many other things, and also their own crimes like Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think there's always double standards when foreign secretaries and politicians point the finger at Russia. The old cliche goes, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones.
When West goes on the moral ground, that is the problem. I mean, whatever they do, they should not invoke moral considerations, because there is a very gray area, and their record is definitely very it's very taunted. They don't have a proper credentials in criticizing anybody on moral grounds. They have gone to Afghanistan, they go to Iraq, and not just where they went. Just consider how they have been threatening. They have been threatening Iran for the past 35 years. We will do this, we will do that, do this, otherwise we will do this. Now this threatening is almost equal to going to war. And what's the basis of that? I mean, it can't be the basis that I will tell you do this and you will ask me why. I will say, because I say so. This is no legal, or this is no valid ground that you do something because I say so. West has been behaving like that and going to countries on that basis. So they did not have credentials to tell Russia on the moral basis. They could have invoked any other grounds.
We invited the public to give us their view about how they felt it would play out in Ukraine, and whether they felt that Western actions could themselves spark a war. What do you think will happen in Ukraine, and do you think Western actions themselves might spark a war?
I don't know. I think it probably is a risky situation because of the complexity, because of the dangers of armaments. So I don't know, just that it's complex. Having to grapple with it being complex in itself is a reality and maybe no bad thing. But I honestly don't know.
Western action sparking a war, I doubt. I mean, we aren't talking, say 70, 80 years ago. Right now in the situation with globalization, everyone's tied in terms of, trade, people's media coverage. Everything's so global. I can't see a war sparking. And even if a so-called war was to happen, I can imagine it would be very, maybe similar to the Cold War in some respects of it being ideological rather than all-out warfare on the ground.
I don't think a conflict is going to be sparked, definitely not a war. I think what's going to happen is people are going to rethink how states should act to each other. So I think, for example, the Crimea seceding, that's in a way within their rights if they decide to do that. So maybe that's going to get people in the West to rethink other secessionist movements in their own countries.
What do you think will happen in Ukraine, and do you think Western actions could themselves spark a war?
I definitely don't think that there will be a war between East and West, because I think neither can afford it at the moment, particularly with the way things are going at the moment in society. I think that there's definitely going to be something, they're going to draw a line under it, something's going to happen, they're going to have like a private meeting or something and it will end as it is, because it's just, I mean, I really doubt that there's going to be a wide-scale war just because of Ukraine, you know. In particular because at the moment in this country we have so many we have so many things going on with the economy and stuff, so many more important things to focus about than going to war, so I'm sure that they'll find a way to deal with it.
No, I don't think so. I think that if one looks at history, which everybody appears to be doing resolutely, that the Americans' ability to get involved in any conflict anywhere, either successfully or on time, is pretty remote. I think if you look at Vietnam, which they ploughed loads of energy, loads of armaments in, when you look at what we did in Malaysia, which was the same problem, they're not very good at hearts and minds. I have to say that strangely, Putin is.
Can we predict what will happen in the Ukraine? Could the West's actions themselves be responsible for sparking a war? We turn to our experts for a final point of view.
I don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine. I think that, you know, Ukraine militarily isn't in a position to take on Russia, and they'll be stupid to do so. So I think that, you know, Crimea has been annexed into Russia, and, you know, that's that. You know, they had their vote, and Russia's not going to listen to anybody. In terms of Western interference or Western involvement, I don't think the West will get involved militarily. You know, Russia isn't Afghanistan and Russia isn't Iraq. Russia has the capability and the military power to be able to fight back and hit, you know, America. And we live in an increasingly globalized world. So, you know, gas, 30% of Germany's gas is from Russia, so that's obviously going to affect the economy and many other countries in Europe, so it could lead to an increase in gas prices. So I don't think that they'll be getting involved in militarily, and I don't think that anybody's stupid enough to go to war over this. They're just going to have to accept that Russia has done this, just as Russia accepted that there was a change of regime in Libya and Iraq, thanks to the West.
A war is a remote possibility, given the fact that today also President Obama has said that military solution he has ruled out, because it won't be a sort of you know, it won't be a sort of small game. It will be a huge devastation. So war may be a remote possibility, if at all, but Ukraine has got destabilized. Crimea has come out. Other parts, east and south of Ukraine, which are inhabited by Russian-speaking and people favoring Russia. We must also know that most of the Ukrainian Christians, they have allegiance to the Russian Orthodox Church. So that way, I think Ukraine will further disintegrate. Not only Crimea, the other parts may also, they might also ask for a referendum, and if they are not given the referendum, it will be instability, chaos. But we are in for some period of chaos now in Ukraine.
Anglo-American criticisms of Russia for infringing the sovereignty of another country are clearly hypocritical, given America and Britain's own interventions in places such as Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Afghanistan and Syria. So even as the threats are made and retaliation is considered, it is impossible to ignore the double standards of the West. Most ominously of all, while the hypocrisy is obvious, the potentially explosive consequences are as yet unknown.